He invited the maid to his grand gala only to humiliate her. But when she arrived like a true diva, he realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Vanessa was on her knees polishing the Italian marble floor when she heard the clicking heels of Alexander's secretary echoing down the corridor. It was 7 a.m., and she had already been working for 2 hours, just like she had every day for the past 3 years. The Belmont mansion had 42 rooms, and every inch had to be spotless for her boss's constant business meetings and visits. Alexander Belmont descended the grand staircase, adjusting his Hermes tie, his phone glued to his ear as he discussed numbers Vanessa couldn't even imagine. At 45, he ran a real estate empire that built skyscrapers and shaped the city skyline. Everyone knew the Belmont name. Everyone respected his fortune. And everyone knew he liked to make sure of that. "I want everything ready by Thursday," he said on the phone, walking right past Vanessa as if she were part of the decor. "The party has to be perfect. 200 guests, only the elite. No mistakes." Vanessa kept scrubbing the floor, focused on removing a stubborn stain, probably from some expensive wine spill during the last business meeting. She had mastered the art of being invisible, of doing her job without being noticed. It was safer that way. "And hire more waiters," Alexander continued, now standing at the entrance to the main hall, watching Vanessa at work. "I want everything running like a Swiss clock. This party will seal several important deals." When he finally hung up, the silence was tense. Vanessa could feel his eyes on her, that unsettling sensation of being analyzed. Slowly she stood up, wiping her hands on the blue apron she wore every day. "Good morning, Mr. Belmont," she said politely. "Vanessa." His voice carried a tone she couldn't quite decipher. "I need to talk to you." She nodded, putting her cleaning supplies back on the cart. Alexander walked over to the marble fireplace, staring at the expensive European painting above it, a painting Vanessa never knew the name of. "On Thursday, we'll be hosting the company's annual gala," he began. "As always, you'll be in charge of the final cleanup before the guests arrive." "Yes, sir. But this year will be different." Alexander turned toward her, a strange smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "This year, you won't just clean, you'll attend." Vanessa's stomach tightened. Something in the way he said it made her uneasy. "Attend? As what, sir? As a guest?" The words hung in the air like a ticking bomb. Alexander began pacing around her, his hands clasped behind his back. "It's simple. You'll dress appropriately and attend the party like any other guest. You'll dine at the main table, mingle with the others, and behave as though you belong there." Vanessa instantly knew there was something behind it. Alexander Belmont never did anything without a reason, especially anything that looked like kindness toward employees. "May I ask why?" "Because I want you to learn an important lesson about knowing your place in the world." The coldness in his voice made her understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't generosity. It was calculated cruelty. Vanessa kept her voice steady, even as her heart raced. "I understand," she replied. "Good. I'll arrange for a proper dress. Nothing too expensive, of course, but something that won't embarrass me in my own house." Alexander paused, his smile turning sharper. "Oh, and Vanessa, don't worry if you don't know how to behave. I'm sure my guests will be very understanding of your background." The word background rolled off his tongue with disdain, as if she were some kind of pet he was attempting to train. Vanessa bit her lip to stop herself from responding, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "You may go," Alexander said, waving his hand dismissively, the way he always did. "And remember Thursday at 8 p.m. Don't be late." After he left, Vanessa stood alone in the enormous hall, surrounded by luxury she cleaned every day but could never touch. Tears threatened to come, but she held them back. Crying wouldn't change anything. Alexander Belmont thought he knew Vanessa Silva, the humble maid who had shown up at his door 3 years ago, desperate for work. But he had no idea who she really was. That afternoon, while organizing Alexander's private library, Vanessa stumbled upon something that changed everything. Tucked inside a book on contemporary art was a magazine page she recognized instantly. It was a society page photograph from 5 years earlier, and in the center of that photo was her wearing a pink Valentino gown, posing beside powerful businessmen and celebrities at a charity gala. The caption read, "Vanessa Ross, heiress of the Ross textile empire, one of the most elegant women in Brazilian high society." Vanessa closed her eyes, remembering that night. She remembered the camera flashes, the warm greetings, the respect she commanded wherever she went. She remembered when her last name opened doors, when designers fought to dress her, when her opinion influenced million-dollar decisions. And she remembered how it had all vanished in a single night when her father gambled everything. The company owned on risky investments that failed. Within 6 months, the Ross family went from being one of the richest in the country to bankrupt. Her father died of a sudden heart attack when creditors took everything. Her mother, devastated, passed away just 2 months later. Vanessa was only 26 when she lost it all: her family, her fortune, her social status, her so-called friends. Everyone who once worshipped her disappeared like smoke when the money was gone. For 2 years she tried to rebuild her life, but she soon learned that in the world of business, those who fall from the top rarely climb back. That was when she knocked on the door of the Belmont mansion 3 years ago, under a false name, begging for any job. Alexander had hired her as a maid, and she accepted because she needed to survive. But now, staring at that photo, she realized fate was giving her a chance. Alexander wanted to humiliate her in front of the elite. Perfect. She would attend that gala, but not as the humble maid he expected. She would appear as Vanessa Ross, the woman who once commanded boardrooms and diplomatic dinners as effortlessly as breathing. She slipped the photo into her apron pocket and smiled for the first time in 3 years. Alexander Belmont had no idea what was about to happen. He had invited a maid to his gala, but the woman who would walk through those doors was one of the most sophisticated women the elite had ever known. And on Thursday night, the entire city would remember why the name Vanessa Ross had once been synonymous with elegance and power. The next morning, Vanessa woke with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She had only 2 days to prepare, 2 days to plan every detail of her reappearance in the world that once belonged to her. It wouldn't be easy. She had no money for a designer gown or expensive jewelry. But she had something far more valuable: the memory of who she truly was. While cleaning the dining room later that day, she overheard Alexander on the phone, probably speaking with one of the important guests. "Yes, Roberto, it's going to be unforgettable," he said, laughing on the other end of the line. "I have a special surprise for Thursday night. Let's just say my maid is about to give us all a lesson in social aspirations." Vanessa wiped down the mahogany table with a calm smile. Alexander was so confident, so certain of his plan. He had no idea he was about to face a woman who had grown up in ballrooms, who had learned etiquette from Europe's finest instructors, who spoke 4 languages and knew art, music, and literature better than most of his guests. That afternoon, she set out to solve the problem of the dress. She had saved every penny from the meager salary Alexander paid her, but it wasn't enough for anything worthy of such an event. That was when she remembered Helena Marchetti, an Italian seamstress who had worked for the Ross family for years. Helena lived in a modest house in the city center, but her hands were pure gold. She had created some of the most talked-about gowns in high society, including several Vanessa herself had once worn at prestigious events. "Mamma mia!" Helena gasped when she opened the door and saw her. "Bambina, where have you been? I looked for you everywhere." They embraced, both women shedding tears in the warmth of Helena's cozy living room. Though she was over 70, Helena's eyes still sparkled with passion for her craft. "Helena, I need your help," Vanessa explained, sharing her situation but omitting the most painful details. "I have an important event tomorrow night, and say no more." Helena raised a hand, cutting her off. "You are a Ross, and a Ross does not attend a gala without looking absolutely stunning." She led Vanessa to a small back room where her most special creations were stored. Hanging on a lone rack was a gown that took Vanessa's breath away. It was a floor-length Italian silk dress in a deep, striking red. The neckline was elegant yet modest, with long sleeves of delicate transparent lace. The skirt hugged the body perfectly before flowing into a subtle train. Golden hand embroidery traced intricate patterns across the fabric, shimmering under the light. "I made this dress 2 years ago for a client who never came to pick it up," Helena explained, her eyes gleaming. "I always knew it was waiting for the right person." The gown fit Vanessa as though it had been created just for her. Elegant without being gaudy. Sophisticated without arrogance. It was perfect. "Helena, I can't accept this. It must have cost a fortune to make." "Bambina, you don't understand." Helena adjusted the shoulders of the gown tenderly. This dress was meant for a special moment for someone who needs to remind the world of who she truly is. It's not about money. It's about destiny. Helena also insisted on lending Vanessa a set of heirloom jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, a cultured pearl necklace with diamond clasps, delicate earrings that caught the light just right, and a bracelet that completed the ensemble without excess. "Tomorrow night, when you step into that party," Helena said, holding Vanessa's hands firmly, "I want you to remember one thing. Class cannot be bought. Elegance cannot be learned overnight. And dignity, no one can take that from you. You were born with it, raised with it. You only forgot for a little while." Vanessa left Helena's home carrying the carefully wrapped gown and jewelry, but more importantly, carrying something she hadn't felt in years: confidence. When she caught her reflection in a store window on the way back, for the first time in 3 years, she didn't see Vanessa Silva, the maid. She saw Vanessa Ross, the woman who once commanded respect and admiration everywhere she went. Thursday arrived like a storm at the Belmont mansion. Decoration teams, florists, waiters, musicians, everyone rushed around, preparing every last detail for the most important social event of the year. Vanessa oversaw the final touches, but her mind was elsewhere. At 5 p.m., she finished her chores and retreated to the small room in the attic where she had lived for 3 years. Tonight, it would serve as her dressing room for the transformation she had been waiting for. She took a long shower, polished her nails with the deep red polish she had bought for the occasion, and began to get ready with the care of a soldier preparing for battle. The gown slid over her body like a second skin. The jewelry added the perfect final touch of sophistication. She pinned her hair into a low, elegant bun, letting a few strands frame her face. Her makeup was discreet yet flawless, highlighting the green eyes that had always been her most striking feature. When she looked into the mirror, Vanessa had to fight back tears. Staring back at her was not the maid who had scrubbed floors for 3 years. It was the same woman who once graced magazine covers, who dined with ambassadors and prime ministers, who led board meetings with natural elegance and iron resolve. Downstairs, the first guests were arriving. Laughter, conversations, the pop of champagne corks. It was time. Vanessa picked up the small clutch Helena had lent her, took one last deep breath, and opened the door. Every step down the service staircase was deliberate, every movement calculated for maximum impact. When she reached the main floor, she paused for a moment, taking in the spectacle. The grand hall was magnificently decorated. Hundreds of candles created a magical atmosphere. The guests were exactly who she expected, the city's political, social, and financial elite. At the center of it all stood Alexander Belmont, beaming with confidence as he entertained a group of powerful businessmen. He looked delighted, clearly anticipating the moment when his surprise would appear and be humiliated before everyone. But it wasn't Alexander who saw her first. It was Roberto Castellano. He was sipping his whiskey when his eyes landed on the figure standing at the entrance. The glass froze halfway to his lips. His face went pale. "It can't be," he muttered. Marina Tavares, standing nearby, turned to see what had caught his attention. The moment her eyes fell on Vanessa, she almost dropped her champagne flute. Her hand flew to her chest as recognition washed over her face. One by one, others began to notice. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter faded into silence. A hush spread across the hall like ripples on a pond. Carlos Montenegro dropped his fork onto his plate. The French ambassador's wife tugged urgently at her husband's sleeve, whispering in his ear. The finance minister squinted, as if doubting his own eyes. And then Vanessa began to walk. Each step was a masterclass in grace. She didn't walk like a nervous maid pretending to fit in. She walked like a queen returning to her kingdom, her posture straight, chin lifted slightly, lips curved in a confident smile that had once been her signature. The hall was silent. 200 people stared at the woman in red moving among them with an elegance most of them had rarely witnessed. Alexander, sensing something unusual, turned slowly. His smile was still in place until his eyes landed on her. It died instantly. "Good evening, Alexander," Vanessa said, her voice clear and melodic, echoing through the hushed hall. "Thank you for the invitation. That was very kind of you." For a moment, he stared at her as though seeing a ghost. The woman before him wasn't the timid maid who scrubbed his floors. She was a vision of sophistication, radiating confidence and power. Vanessa. Roberto Castellano stepped forward, still in disbelief. "Vanessa Ross, my God, it really is you." Her name thundered through the room like a storm. Vanessa Ross. Whispers swept across the crowd like wildfire. Some remembered her vividly. Others only recognized the name, but all of them knew what that name once meant. "Hello, Roberto," Vanessa replied smoothly, extending her hand with the ease of someone used to being greeted in high society. "It's such a pleasure to see you again." Roberto kissed her hand reverently, still shaken. "But what are you doing here? How do you know Alexander?" Marina Tavares rushed forward, her eyes shining with emotion. "Vanessa Ross, darling. You vanished from society. We searched for you at every event these past years." Alexander stood frozen, pale and tense, trying to process what was unfolding. His maid was being welcomed like royalty by the very people he most admired. "Excuse me," he interrupted, his voice thinner than intended. You all know each other?" Carlos Montenegro chuckled, clapping Alexander on the back. "Know her?" Alexander. Vanessa Ross was one of the most influential women in Brazilian high society. Her family had companies all over the world. "Had?" Alexander repeated, stunned. "There were some financial setbacks a few years ago," Vanessa explained with dignity, her tone calm and diplomatic. "But life goes on, doesn't it?" And at that moment, Alexander finally began to understand. His maid was no ordinary woman desperate for work. She was a fallen heiress, one who had once possessed as much money as he did, perhaps more. And for 3 years he had treated her like dirt, humiliating her, making her scrub his house. The realization hit him like a hammer. Dinner was served at 9 p.m. Vanessa found herself seated at the main table, right beside the French ambassador and across from Marina Tavares. Alexander, clearly rattled, had discreetly rearranged the seating plan. Originally, he had intended to stick her at a back table to embarrass her, but now he had no choice. His guests demanded her presence at the center of it all. As smoked salmon and caviar were served, Marina could no longer hold back her curiosity. "Vanessa, dear," she said softly, though her words carried across the table, "I must ask what really happened to Ross Industries. One day you were buying companies in Europe, and the next you were simply gone." The hall grew quieter. Many leaned in, pretending not to listen, but hanging on every word. Even Alexander stopped cutting his food, eager for an answer. It was the first time anyone had dared to ask her directly. Vanessa took a sip of her red wine before replying, her voice poised and steady. "My father was always a visionary," she began, "but sometimes vision takes us too far. He invested heavily in emerging markets that never developed as expected. When the global financial crisis hit, we lost everything in a matter of months." "And your family?" Carlos Montenegro asked gently, his eyes full of concern. Vanessa's expression softened, though her composure never faltered. My father suffered a heart attack when he realized the full extent of the losses. My mother, she could not withstand the grief that followed. Within 6 months, I lost both my parents and all that remained of our fortune." A respectful silence blanketed the table. Several guests lowered their eyes, visibly moved. "I remember Giuseppe," Roberto Castellano said quietly, shaking his head. "He was an honorable man. It must have been devastating for him to lose the empire he built." "It was," Vanessa admitted. "But he always taught me that true wealth is not in what we own, it's in what we carry here." She touched her chest lightly. "Knowledge, values, dignity. Those are things no one can take away." Across the table, Alexander swallowed hard. Every word she spoke was a lesson in class, a kind of class he himself had never possessed. Marina hesitated, then asked carefully, "But how did you end up working for Alexander?" Vanessa finished smoothly, turning her gaze directly toward him. The words hit like a knife. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "After everything collapsed," Vanessa continued, "I discovered that friends in high society are like greenhouse flowers, beautiful in perfect conditions, but they wither the moment the environment changes. I was left with nothing but my determination to survive, and so I accepted the work I could find." The French ambassador frowned, his voice carrying authority. "In France, we respect those who face hardship with dignity. That shows true character." "Exactly," agreed the minister's wife. "Vanessa, you always had a natural elegance that went far beyond money. I remember when you organized that charity gala for underprivileged children. You raised $2 million in a single night." Alexander nearly choked on his wine. $2 million? His maid had once raised more in one evening than he earned in months. "That was a special night," Vanessa said with a soft smile. "We managed to build 3 children's hospitals with those funds." "You built hospitals?" Alexander blurted out, louder than intended. "It was one of the Ross family's main commitments," Roberto explained, his tone firm. "They always invested heavily in social projects. Vanessa personally oversaw several initiatives." The conversation flowed, and with each passing minute, Alexander's humiliation deepened. His maid was discussing international politics with authority, conversing fluently in French with the ambassador, and offering insights on art that left seasoned critics nodding in agreement. "Vanessa," Carlos Montenegro said during the main course, "I don't know if you're aware, but I still have that painting your father sold me before everything. It remains one of the treasures of my collection." "The Monet?" Vanessa asked, her eyes lighting up. "The very one," Carlos replied with a smile. "Giuseppe told me he wanted it to stay with someone who truly appreciated art." Alexander nearly dropped his fork. His maid was casually discussing Monet as if it were family memorabilia. "I'm glad it's in good hands," Vanessa said warmly, her voice tinged with bittersweet memory. By the time dessert arrived Belgian chocolate with red berries, Marina finally asked the question on everyone's mind. "Vanessa, what do you plan to do now? With your experience and your connections, surely you can rebuild." "It's not that simple," Vanessa said kindly. "The business world has a short memory for success and a long one for failure, and starting over requires capital." "Nonsense," Roberto suddenly exclaimed, slamming his hand on the table. "Vanessa, you have something money can't buy: credibility. I would finance any project of yours without hesitation." "I would as well," Carlos added firmly. "Your father was one of the most honorable men I ever knew. His daughter deserves our full trust." "Indeed," said Ambassador Dubois, leaning forward. "Mademoiselle, if you're interested in European markets, I could introduce you to investors in Paris. They would be eager to meet someone with your expertise." Alexander sat frozen, his chest tightening with dread. In a single night, his maid was receiving more business offers than he had in months' offers from the very people he respected most. The evening carried on, but the balance of power in the room had shifted entirely. As the hours passed, Vanessa moved gracefully from group to group. Wherever she went, conversations hushed and then reignited around her. Guests leaned in to hear her thoughts on economics, on international trade, on art and philanthropy. Alexander, meanwhile, could do nothing but watch from the sidelines. The woman he had intended to humiliate was now the center of attention, commanding the respect of everyone he admired. At one point, Vanessa was speaking with a circle of investors about environmental projects in the Amazon. "It's risky," one man said. "Too much initial capital, uncertain returns." "On the contrary," Vanessa replied smoothly, "properly structured environmental projects have been some of the most profitable in recent years. The key is the business model. Combine carbon credit systems with controlled ecotourism, and you could triple your return in 5 years." The group fell silent, clearly impressed. "Do you have data to support that projection?" another asked skeptically. "I do. In fact, I designed a similar model for a Canadian firm 6 years ago. The profits exceeded all expectations." Alexander drifted closer, pretending to look for a drink. In truth, he was eavesdropping on his maid, as she gave financial advice worth millions to some of the richest men in the country. "Vanessa," one of the businessmen said finally, "you need to come back into the corporate world. Wasting a mind like yours is a crime." "That's exactly what I've been saying," Marina chimed in. "Darling, you should consider opening a consultancy. With your international background and market knowledge, it would be an instant success." Standing nearby, Alexander's stomach churned. A terrible realization hit him. For 3 years, he had had one of the brightest business minds in the country under his own roof, and he had wasted it. Worse, he had belittled and humiliated her daily. Around 11 p.m., as many guests were preparing to leave, Roberto Castellano approached Alexander with a grave expression. "Alexander, we need to talk in private." They stepped aside into a quiet corner of the hall. "Listen carefully," Roberto said, his tone firm. "I don't know what the nature of your professional relationship is with Vanessa, but you'd better recognize the treasure you have in front of you." "Treasure?" Alexander asked, incredulous. "Vanessa Ross is one of the most intelligent and connected women I've ever met. If you manage to bring her in as a partner or senior consultant, your business will soar beyond what you can imagine." Roberto paused, studying Alexander's face. "But there's something else. Vanessa has always been a woman of integrity. Even when wronged, she would never harm anyone. If you don't treat her with the respect she deserves, you'll have to deal with me personally." The threat was clear. Roberto Castellano was one of the most powerful men in the country, and he had just made it known that he considered Vanessa under his protection. I understand," Alexander muttered. "I hope you do." Roberto gave him a sharp look before walking away. When the last guests had gone and the grand hall was empty again, Alexander found Vanessa gathering the forgotten glasses and returning them to a tray, slipping back into her role as if nothing had changed. "Vanessa, stop," he said quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She turned, still holding the tray. "What is it, Mr. Belmont?" "We need to talk. About the last 3 years. About how I treated you. About who you really are." Vanessa set the tray down and waited, her expression calm, unyielding. "I didn't know," Alexander said at last. "I had no idea who you were when I hired you." "And if you had known?" Vanessa asked directly. "Would it have made a difference?" The honesty of the question pierced him. He hesitated, then admitted quietly, "Maybe. Probably." "Then nothing changes," she replied evenly. "You disrespected me because you thought I was beneath you. Discovering that I was once wealthy doesn't erase the fact that you judge people by their bank accounts, not their character." Alexander lowered his head. She was right. "Vanessa, I want to make this right. I want to offer you a senior position in my company. A proper salary, profit sharing. Why now?" She interrupted sharply. "Because your friends validated me? Because they treated me as an equal?" Alexander had no answer. "I'll think about your offer," she said at last, "but not out of gratitude and not because I need your approval. If I accept, it will be on my terms." She turned to leave, but paused at the foot of the stairs. Alexander, tonight you learned something important about me. I hope you also learned something about yourself." With that, she climbed the staircase, leaving him alone with the crushing certainty that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. The next morning, Vanessa woke at 5 a.m., just as she always did, but this time not to scrub floors. She sat at the edge of her bed, still processing the events of the night before. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't sure what her role in that house really was. By 6:30, she went downstairs to the kitchen. Normally, Alexander would still be asleep, but to her surprise, he was already there sitting alone at the breakfast table, wearing a robe, his hair messy, dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning," Vanessa said simply, reaching for the cupboard where her apron was kept. "Vanessa, no." Alexander stood quickly, nearly spilling his coffee. "You don't need to. I mean, after last night." "After last night, what?" She interrupted, her hand still on the cupboard. "I still live here. I still need to work to support myself. As far as I know, nothing has changed." He ran a hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. "But after what I discovered about you, about who you really are, I'm the same person I was yesterday morning." Vanessa cut in, pulling out her apron. "The only difference is that now you know a few things about my past. That doesn't change who I am today." She began preparing breakfast with the same efficiency as always, but there was something different in her posture. No longer submission. It was professionalism, her choice to do the job well, not his demand. At 7:15, Alexander's phone rang. He answered, and his expression immediately stiffened. "Alexander," the voice of Roberto Castellano boomed through the line. "We need to meet urgently. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Before Alexander could reply, the call ended. He looked at Vanessa, who was setting the table with her usual precision. "Roberto's coming here," he said nervously. "It must be about the business you discussed last night." "I imagined so," Vanessa replied without even glancing up. "He seemed very interested in expanding into the Asian market." Alexander blinked. "How do you know that? You weren't even near us when we talked about Singapore." "I was serving drinks at the next table," she said calmly. "When you work as staff, you learn how to listen without seeming to pay attention." She paused, finally meeting his eyes. "You were discussing investments in Singapore. I may be wrong, but I believe Roberto wants to propose a partnership." 20 minutes later, Roberto arrived accompanied by Carlos Montenegro. Both men looked determined, speaking in low tones as Alexander ushered them into the living room. Vanessa followed with a tray of coffee and biscuits, behaving exactly as she always did during business meetings. Except this time, the men greeted her differently. "Vanessa," Roberto said warmly, standing to shake her hand, "it's wonderful to see you again. I trust you slept well after last night." "Very well, thank you," she replied smoothly, pouring coffee. "I hope you both enjoyed the gala." "It was unforgettable," Carlos said, accepting his cup. Then he exchanged a glance with Roberto. "In fact, we're here to discuss something important." Vanessa made a polite move to step back, as she had countless times before, but Roberto raised a hand. "Please, stay. What we have to say involves you." Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He clearly wasn't used to his staff being included in boardroom discussions. "Vanessa," Roberto began, "Carlos and I spoke at length last night. We both agree it's a waste for someone with your experience to be kept away from the market." "That's kind of you," Vanessa said cautiously. "Let me finish," Roberto pressed. "We have a proposal. Carlos and I are launching an investment fund focused on emerging Latin American markets. And," Roberto added, "we have contacts in London and Paris who can help restore your European network. Within 2 years, you'll be back exactly where you belong." Vanessa sat in silence for a moment, processing the offer. Alexander, on the other hand, went pale. He realized he was about to lose the most valuable person who had ever walked into his life. "It's an extraordinary offer," Vanessa said finally. "We need someone with international connections, European ties, and experience managing large assets." Carlos leaned forward, his tone firm. "The role would be executive director. Starting salary, $500,000 a year, plus profit sharing, office, assistants, full travel budget. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. 500,000. More than Alexander paid her in 20 years. But I'll need a few days to think. Of course, Carlos agreed, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait. When Roberto and Carlos left, the silence in the mansion was deafening. Alexander paced the living room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, 500,000? For her? For me? Vanessa corrected gently. It's a fair salary for the position. Vanessa, about my offer from last night, we can renegotiate. I'll make it better. She stopped him with a firm look. Alexander, you're offering me something now because you're afraid I'll accept their proposal. That's not respect. That's fear. He had no answer. That afternoon, Vanessa was tidying up the living room when she suddenly stopped and looked at Alexander. May I ask you something? She said calmly. Of course. Why did you really invite me to the gala? Her voice was steady, but her eyes were sharp. What exactly was your plan? Alexander froze. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, he chose honesty. I wanted you to feel out of place, he admitted. I wanted my guests to see a maid pretending to be one of them and laugh at the absurdity. And afterward, I hoped you'd be so humiliated you'd never again try to rise above the position I thought you belonged to. Vanessa nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Thank you for your honesty. She finished arranging the cushions and turned toward the door. Before leaving, she glanced back at him. Do you want to know the difference between you and men like Roberto or Carlos? Alexander hesitated, then gave a small nod. They see potential in people and want to develop it. You see threats and want to destroy them. That's the difference between true leaders and men who merely accumulate wealth. With that, she walked out, leaving Alexander speechless, her words echoing in his mind like a verdict. Later that afternoon, while Alexander was away in meetings, Vanessa received an unexpected visitor. When she opened the front door of the mansion, there stood Marina Tavares, elegant as always, though her expression was unusually serious. Vanessa, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. Please, come in, Vanessa replied warmly, guiding her to the sitting room. Marina sat gracefully on the sofa, glancing around the room where just hours earlier Roberto and Carlos had made their extraordinary offer. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation last night, Marina began, about second chances, about rebuilding one's life. It was a special night, Vanessa nodded quietly. It was. I want to share something with you, Marina continued, her eyes softening. 15 years ago, I was just a public school art teacher. I met my husband back when he was still a state deputy, not a minister. At that time, I always felt inferior at political events, like I didn't belong in that world. Vanessa leaned forward, listening intently. But then, Marina said with a smile, a woman told me something that changed my perspective forever. She said, Marina, you don't need to shrink yourself to make others feel big. Your intelligence, your sensitivity, your knowledge, they have value of their own. Marina's voice trembled slightly. Do you know who that woman was? Your mother, Sophia Ross. She told me that at a charity dinner. I never forgot her words. Vanessa felt her eyes sting with tears. It had been so long since anyone had spoken of her mother with such affection. My mother always knew how to encourage people, she whispered. And now, Marina said, leaning forward to clasp Vanessa's hands, I want to encourage you. Last night, I saw Sophia Ross's daughter reborn before my eyes. Don't ever let anyone convince you to settle for less than you deserve. Vanessa squeezed her hands back, overwhelmed by emotion. In that moment, it wasn't just her own strength she carried. It was her mother's legacy, alive through the people she had once inspired. When Alexander returned home around 6 p.m., he found Vanessa in the library, seated comfortably with a book on international economics open in her hands. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her hair loose, looking entirely absorbed in her reading. Studying? He asked, trying to sound casual. "Updating myself on recent changes in European trade policies," she replied evenly. "If I accept Roberto and Carlos's offer, I'll need to be up to date." His heart tightened. "If you accept?" He paused. "Vanessa, may I propose something?" She closed the book and looked at him, her expression firm. "Give me 1 week," she said before he could continue. "1 week to show you what I can do for your company. Not as your maid, but as a consultant. If, after that week, you're not convinced of my value, I'll accept Roberto's proposal without hesitation. And if I am convinced," he asked carefully, "then we'll discuss a real partnership on equal terms." Alexander studied her face, recognizing the determination he had seen in her at the gala, the kind of strength he had learned to respect in just a few short days. 1 week, he agreed at last, but with one condition. Her eyebrow arched slightly. "Which is? During this week, you will do no domestic work, no cleaning, no serving coffee. You'll work exclusively as a consultant." For the first time in years, Vanessa allowed herself a genuine smile. "Agreed." They shook hands, and in that moment, both of them knew the dynamic had changed forever. The maid was gone. In her place stood Vanessa Ross, a businesswoman, ready to prove that true phoenixes don't just rise from the ashes. They emerge stronger than ever. Monday morning began at 7 a.m. sharp. Vanessa sat in Alexander's main office, her posture confident, stacks of financial documents spread neatly across the desk. She had requested 5 years' worth of reports, current contracts, and future projections. Alexander lingered nearby, visibly restless as she flipped through the papers with sharp precision. "Have you found anything interesting?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, though his anxiety seeped through. Vanessa looked up, her expression serious. "Alexander, may I be direct?" "Of course. Your company has been stagnant for 3 years. Growth is practically zero. In the past year alone, you lost 2 major contracts. And you're recycling the same investment patterns that worked in 2015 but no longer work in 2024. The words struck him like blows. He had known things weren't ideal, but hearing them summarized so bluntly was devastating. "And what would you suggest?" he asked, fighting to maintain his composure. Vanessa rose from her chair and walked toward the large window overlooking the city skyline. Her voice was calm but cutting. "First, you must diversify. The construction market here is saturated. Second, you must innovate. Sustainability is no longer a trend, it's a requirement. Third, you need international partnerships." She turned back to him, her eyes steady. "But before we talk solutions, I need to understand something. Why are you making such conservative choices? You have capital. You have infrastructure. You have a name in the market. So why are you playing not to lose instead of playing to win?" Alexander remained silent for several long moments. It was the first time in years someone had dared question his strategy so directly. "Because I'm afraid," he admitted finally. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Afraid of risking everything. Of losing it all, like I've seen happen to other companies. Like it happened to my father?" Vanessa asked softly. He nodded. "Yes. The difference," she said firmly, "is that my father risked everything in one desperate move when he was already in trouble. You, Alexander, are standing still out of fear when you actually have everything you need to succeed." She returned to the desk, spreading out documents. "Let me show you something." For the next 2 hours, Vanessa outlined a bold expansion plan, entering emerging Latin American markets with a focus on sustainable construction and social housing. The plan included government partnerships, international financing, and the use of innovative building technologies. Alexander sat in stunned silence, flipping through her charts and projections. "Where did you learn all this?" he finally asked, astonished. "My father," Vanessa replied. "At Harvard, where I completed my MBA at 22. And later, through experience running a multinational empire until I lost it all." She paused, meeting his eyes. "Information you would have known had you ever bothered to ask who was cleaning your floors." Her words cut deep, But Alexander didn't argue. For the first time, he realized he was in the presence of someone who could see further ahead than he ever had. On Tuesday morning, Vanessa scheduled a video conference with 3 potential international partners contacts she had known back in her Ross Industries days. Alexander sat to the side, arms crossed, trying to look composed but clearly nervous. These were high-level players, and he wasn't sure how his maid even now. It was hard to let go of that image would handle it. When the call began, Vanessa slipped seamlessly into business mode. She greeted each executive fluently in their native language, English, Spanish, then French, before diving into the discussion. "Senator Martinez," she said warmly to a Mexican businessman on the screen, "I understand your concerns about deadlines, but I'm confident we can find a solution that benefits both sides." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had expected formality, maybe stiffness. Instead, Vanessa was natural, authoritative, and utterly persuasive. Within 40 minutes, she had secured an in-person meeting in Mexico City for the following week and interest in a $2 million housing project. When the call ended, Alexander could hardly believe it. How did you do that?" he stammered. "Luis Martinez and I partnered on a project in Chile 8 years ago," Vanessa explained as she saved files to the laptop. "We lost touch after my family's collapse, but he always respected me professionally." "You mean he doesn't care that you've," Alexander struggled for words, "that I've spent the last 3 years as a maid?"
Vanessa finished for him, her gaze sharp. "No, Alexander."
In international business, people don't care where you've been, they care about competence, integrity, and results. Whether you've been a maid for 3 years or a king for 3 years doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can deliver. Her calm confidence left him speechless. He realized that in less than an hour, she had achieved something he hadn't managed in years, opening doors to lucrative international expansion. For the first time, Alexander began to understand just how blind he had been. On Wednesday morning, Vanessa walked into Alexander's office with a thick folder of research in her hands. She placed it neatly on his desk. "This is a full competitor analysis," she said, her tone firm and professional. Alexander leaned forward, curious. "Competitors? Your biggest rival, Santos Construction, is facing serious cash flow problems," Vanessa explained, flipping through detailed graphs and reports. "They lost a $50 million contract just last week. This is the perfect time for you to make a proposal to the same clients and secure the deal." Alexander's eyes widened. "That information isn't public. How do you know this?" Vanessa gave a small, knowing smile. "Patricia Santos was my classmate at Harvard. We still talk occasionally. Let's just say I have sources." He sat back, stunned. "You have a network I could never build, not in 20 years. 30, she corrected smoothly. "And some of these contacts you could never reach at all, no matter how much time you had." "Why not?" he asked, almost defensively. "Because they value character more than money," Vanessa replied without hesitation. "And character isn't something you can buy or develop overnight." Alexander felt the sting of her words. But at the same time, he couldn't deny her results. She wasn't just exposing his company's weaknesses, she was handing him opportunities he hadn't even seen. For the first time in a long while, Alexander realized something uncomfortable yet undeniable. Without Vanessa, he was already losing. On Thursday morning, Vanessa called for a meeting with the department managers of Belmont Construction. Alexander sat in the corner of the boardroom, silent, almost like an observer. He wanted to see how his staff people who had worked under him for years would react to Vanessa. The reaction was immediate. The moment she began speaking, the room shifted. "The engineering department," Vanessa started, looking directly at the head engineer, "is working with technology that's at least 10 years old. Meanwhile, your competitors are investing in modular construction and even 3D printed structures." The man frowned defensively. "Those innovations cost millions. We don't have that kind of budget." "And not investing," Vanessa countered firmly, "is costing you tens of millions in lost contracts." You're focused on costs instead of opportunities. That's why you're falling behind. She turned to the financial manager. Roberto, you mentioned you have $5 million sitting in low-yield accounts. That's enough to modernize the engineering department completely. The financial manager hesitated. But that would be a risk. Everything is a risk, Vanessa replied without missing a beat. The real question is, do you take calculated risks that can multiply your revenue, or do you choose the certainty of stagnation until your competitors leave you in the dust? The room went silent. No one dared argue further. Alexander watched in disbelief. These were the same senior managers who often pushed back against his own proposals. Yet here they were, listening to Vanessa as if she were the CEO. Her presence commanded respect. Her logic was unshakable. After the meeting ended and the managers filed out, Alexander stayed behind with her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally. "Why are you helping me after the way I treated you?" Vanessa gathered her papers calmly before answering. "Because this is a test for me too. For 3 years, I doubted myself. I wondered if I still had the skills I once had. If I could still analyze markets, lead teams, close deals. Working with your company is proving I haven't lost a thing." She paused, then looked at him directly. "In fact, starting over gave me something I didn't have before: perspective." "What kind of perspective?" he asked quietly. "The kind you only gain when survival becomes your teacher. I've learned resilience, adaptability, humility, qualities I never had when I was 25 and living in comfort. Those qualities make me a far better businesswoman today than I ever was back then." Alexander said nothing, but deep inside, he knew she was right. On Friday morning, Vanessa walked into Alexander's office carrying a thick binder. She placed it on his desk with deliberate calm. "This," she said, "is a complete restructuring plan for Belmont Construction." Alexander opened it and began flipping through the pages. It was 40 pages long, covering everything from operational changes to international expansion strategies. Charts, projections, risk assessments, every detail was laid out with surgical precision. "This could increase your company's revenue by 300% within 2 years, Vanessa said, her tone matter-of-fact. Alexander's eyes widened. "Vanessa, this is extraordinary." "It's realistic," she corrected. "Every proposal here is based on hard data and contacts I can activate immediately." He kept reading, page after page, his disbelief growing. Finally, he reached the last section and froze. It wasn't just recommendations. It was a partnership proposal, responsibilities divided, profit-sharing structure, a clear chain of command. You want to be my partner?" Alexander asked, stunned. "I want us to be partners," Vanessa corrected firmly. "Equals. Your company needs renewal. I need a platform to rebuild my career. Together, we can do what neither of us could accomplish alone." "But why here?" he asked cautiously. "Roberto and Carlos offered you far better conditions." Vanessa rose from her chair and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, no longer the maid, but the businesswoman she was always meant to be. "Because Roberto and Carlos want to hire me to do what I already know how to do. You offer me the chance to prove that I can do even more than they imagine." She turned, her voice steady. "And there's something poetic about rebuilding my life in the very place where I hit rock bottom." Alexander studied her face, seeing determination that went far beyond ambition. It was about redemption, about legacy. "And if I don't accept?" he asked. "If I think it's too risky, then you'll remain the man who chose to humiliate his employees instead of recognizing their talent. And on Monday, I'll accept Roberto's offer. And if I do accept, then we'll find out what happens when resources and talent work together, not against each other." Alexander looked down at the final page of the report. His company, stagnant for years, could be transformed. And it was all in the hands of the woman he had once dismissed as nothing more than a maid. He looked up at her, his throat dry. "Vanessa, during these 3 years, were you watching my company, planning all this in secret?" She shook her head, honest as ever. "No. For those 3 years I was surviving day by day. I only began thinking like a businesswoman again after your gala. That night reminded me of who I really am, and of who you really are." She smiled then, not with arrogance, but with calm certainty. "I wasn't born to clean houses, Alexander. I was born to build empires. The question is, do you want to build one with me?" Slowly, Alexander extended his hand across the desk. "Welcome to the partnership, Vanessa." Their handshake sealed more than a business deal. It closed a cycle of humiliation and opened a new chapter built on respect, ambition, and second chances. 6 months later, Vanessa stood on the terrace of the new headquarters of Belmont and Ross International Development, gazing out over the city that had once rejected her and now celebrated her return. The company's golden nameplate gleamed on the building's facade more than just a sign. It was a symbol of resurrection. Her phone rang insistently. It was Carla, her new executive assistant, a young woman Vanessa had hired not just for her skills, but for the hunger she recognized in her, the same hunger she herself had once carried. "Ms. Ross," Carla said briskly, "the French ambassador is online too. He wants to confirm the meeting about the housing project in Marseille." "Put him through," Vanessa replied, adjusting the Armani blazer she had bought the previous week, not out of vanity, but because she could finally dress again as the woman she had always been inside. She answered in flawless French, "Monsieur Dubois, what a pleasure. I trust you are well?" The past 6 months had been nothing short of meteoric. The pilot project in Mexico, which she had secured during her first week as a consultant, had not only succeeded but led to 3 additional international contracts. The company that Alexander had run alone and nearly run into the ground was now 4 times larger, with operations in 5 countries. But the true transformation was deeper than numbers. Alexander walked into her office without knocking, as had become his habit. In the early months, he had clung to formality, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in power. Now, though, their partnership was genuine, built on respect. "The Mexicans just approved the project extension," he said, waving a document. "Another $15 million. Excellent. And Chile?" "Green light," he replied, his grin boyish. "The government approved all the tax incentives you negotiated." Vanessa smiled, remembering how he had doubted her when she first suggested projects in countries he had called too risky. Now, he was the one chasing international opportunities, brushing up on his Spanish, even planning a trip to Europe to explore deals in Germany. "Alexander," she said thoughtfully, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you regret it?" "The way things happened between us?" He hesitated, then looked out through the panoramic window at the sprawling city. "Every day. Not just for the way I treated you, but because I wasted 3 years of my own life being a man I didn't even like." "And who were you then?" she asked softly. He gave a bitter smile. A small man who needed to belittle others to feel big. Someone who confused money with worth. His eyes met hers. "You taught me the difference between being rich and being prosperous." "And what's the difference?" "Rich is having money," he said without hesitation. "Prosperous is creating value, developing people, building something that outlasts you." Vanessa felt a warmth in her chest. He had finally understood. Just then, Carla buzzed in through the intercom. "Ms. Ross, the flowers you ordered have arrived." "Flowers?" Alexander asked curiously. Vanessa's voice softened. "Today marks exactly 1 year since my parents passed. Every year, I visited their graves with simple flowers I could barely afford. This year, for the first time, I can bring them roses worthy of their memory." Alexander stood quietly, then asked gently, "Would you like company?" She gave him a grateful look. "It would be an honor." An hour later, they stood together in front of Giuseppe and Sophia Ross's graves at the Consolaco Cemetery. Vanessa knelt, arranging the white roses carefully, her hands trembling with emotion. "Mom, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I came home." Alexander stood respectfully behind her, but he heard every word. "I couldn't save the empire you built," she continued, "but I built something new, something that honors your values." I finally understand that your true legacy wasn't money, it was the strength to begin again." When she rose, her eyes were filled with tears, but they were tears of peace, not sorrow. "They would be proud," Alexander said simply. "I know they would." When they returned to the office later that evening, the reception area was unusually busy. To Vanessa's surprise, Roberto Castellano and Carlos Montenegro were waiting, accompanied by several high-profile figures she instantly recognized from the international business world. "Vanessa," Roberto greeted her with a wide smile, "I'm glad we caught you at the right time." "At the right time for what?" she asked, intrigued. "For the meeting we scheduled 3 weeks ago," Carlos explained. "The one about the investment merger." Vanessa exchanged a quick look with Alexander. In recent weeks, they had discussed the possibility of forming a major alliance, but neither of them had imagined it would move this quickly. "Of course," Vanessa said, regaining her composure. "Let's move to the main conference room." The meeting lasted 3 intense hours. Discussions, projections, and negotiations flowed across the table. In the end, what emerged was larger than anything Vanessa or Alexander had envisioned. A new international sustainable development consortium was formed with an initial capital of $100 million. Vanessa would serve as chief executive officer. Alexander would take the role of chief operations director. Roberto would manage investments, while Carlos oversaw government relations. As they paused for a short coffee break, Carlos shook his head in wonder. "It's surreal," he said. "1 year ago, Vanessa, you were in such a different place. And now you're leading one of the most ambitious development projects in Latin America." Vanessa's smile was calm but resolute. "Sometimes life puts us exactly where we need to be to learn the lessons we must learn." "And what did you learn?" Roberto asked curiously. "That free fall," she said softly, "can also be flight if you learn how to use your wings." Her words settled over the room like a revelation. Everyone seemed to know instinctively that this was more than business. It was history in the making. A week after the consortium was officially announced, Vanessa sat alone in her office, a glossy magazine spread open across her desk. It was the latest issue of Forbes. On the cover, her own face, wearing a hard hat and reflective vest at a construction site in Mexico, surrounded by smiling children from the new housing project she had spearheaded. The headline read, "The Rebirth of Vanessa Ross: How a Fallen Heiress Became One of the Most Innovative Business Leaders in Latin America." For a long moment, Vanessa simply stared at it, hardly believing it was real. Beside her, in the top drawer of her desk, lay another photograph, the social magazine clipping she had found in Alexander's library months earlier. In it, she stood in a pink Valentino gown, posing with celebrities and business moguls at a charity gala back when her last name alone opened doors. She took both photos out and set them side by side on the desk. In the first, she was elegant because of wealth and luxury. In the second, she was elegant because of dignity, resilience, and purpose. Her phone rang. She answered quickly. "Bambina!" cried Helena Marchetti's familiar voice from the other end. "I just saw the Forbes cover. I'm crying tears of joy." Vanessa smiled, her throat tight with emotion. "Helena, none of this would have been possible without you. If you hadn't given me that red dress—" "No, Cara," Helena interrupted firmly. "I only lent you the gown. The courage to wear it, that was all yours." After the call ended, Vanessa turned toward the window. Outside, she saw Alexander leaving the building, papers in hand, his stride confident. He had changed, too. In the past months, he had grown into a more human leader, a more ethical businessman, a more generous man. His transformation was undeniable, and she knew she had been part of it. Vanessa touched the magazine cover once more, then carefully placed it in the drawer alongside the old photograph. 2 different lives, 2 different women. Yet, both were her. The fall had not destroyed her. It had rebuilt her. 3 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the Copacabana Palace Hotel glittered with chandeliers and the presence of the nation's most powerful business leaders. It was the annual Brazilian Business Foundation Awards, and the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Vanessa arrived in an elegant navy blue gown designed especially for her by Helena Marchetti. It wasn't ostentatious like the couture pieces she had once worn in her old life, but it radiated something far greater: authenticity. Every stitch carried love, faith, and belief in her journey. At her side was Alexander, dressed in a classic black tuxedo. Though confident in boardrooms, he looked nervous tonight. This wasn't just a business deal. It was history. "Are you nervous?" he whispered as they climbed the staircase into the ballroom. "Curious," Vanessa replied with a faint smile. "The last time I stood here, I was a different person. I want to see how it feels to come back as who I've become." Inside, the room was full of familiar faces. Some she remembered from the glittering Ross galas of years past, others she had only recently come to know. But tonight, every gaze that fell upon her was not one of gossip or pity, it was of genuine respect. Marina Tavares was the first to greet her. "Vanessa, Corita, what a special night. Your mother would be radiant with pride if she were here to see this." "Thank you, Marina," Vanessa said softly. "And thank you for reminding me of who I was when I had forgotten." Soon after, Roberto Castellano and Carlos Montenegro approached with their wives and a group of foreign investors. The Belmont and Ross success story had become the most talked about case study in the market, and everyone wanted to meet the woman at its center. "Vanessa," Roberto confessed, shaking her hand firmly, "I have to admit something. When I offered you that position at my firm, I thought I was being generous. Now I see refusing me was the best decision you could have made. What you and Alexander have built is far greater than anything I imagined." "Sometimes," Vanessa said with quiet grace, "the right path isn't the most obvious. I had to prove to myself that I could build from the ground up again." At 8 p.m., the ceremony began. Award after award was given out, applause filling the ballroom. Finally, the announcer's voice rose with excitement. "And now, the final honor of the evening, Businesswoman of the Year." The presenter began narrating her story for the entire audience. Vanessa Ross represents the very best of Brazilian entrepreneurship, a woman who faced the greatest adversity, losing everything, yet transformed defeat into victory, loss into learning, and downfall into a new ascent. Applause thundered across the room as Vanessa rose to her feet and walked gracefully to the stage. Hundreds of eyes followed her, admiration shining in their faces. She accepted the golden trophy, pausing for a moment to steady her emotions before addressing the crowd. "When I was first invited to accept this award," she began, her voice strong and clear, "my instinct was to decline. How could someone who spent 3 years cleaning houses possibly stand here as an example of excellence in business?" A murmur spread through the audience. Many knew her story, but few expected her to acknowledge it so directly. "But then I realized," Vanessa continued, "that this award is not only about success. It is about the human capacity to start over, to reinvent ourselves, to transform what feels like the end into a new beginning." Her eyes swept the room, finally finding Alexander in the front row. He was on his feet, applauding her with a proud smile. "In recent months," she said, her voice softening, "I've learned that true leadership is not about having power over others. It's about using your power to lift others higher. One of the most important people in my journey is here tonight. Alexander Belmont made mistakes with me, yes, but he also had the courage to recognize them and the wisdom to change. Today, we are not just partners in business, but in the mission of proving that true success is measured by the positive impact we leave behind." The hall erupted in applause, louder and longer than any moment of the evening. Vanessa raised the trophy high, not as a personal victory, but as a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and transformation. After the ceremony, the ballroom opened into a glittering cocktail reception. Waiters floated through the crowd with trays of champagne and canapes, while clusters of entrepreneurs, investors, and journalists surrounded Vanessa, eager to speak with her. She answered questions, exchanged cards, and posed for photos. But it wasn't the powerful men in suits or the flashing cameras that touched her most. It was the timid young woman who approached her near the edge of the room. "Miss Ross?" the girl asked softly, her voice trembling. Vanessa turned, surprised to see someone so young, no more than 25, with wide, hopeful eyes. "Yes, my name is Sophia," she said, clutching her purse nervously. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For proving that it's possible to start over." Her voice cracked. 2 years ago, my family's company went bankrupt. We lost everything. Since then, I've been working as a waitress just to survive. I thought my life was over. But then, I heard your story. And tonight, seeing you win this award, it gave me hope that maybe I can rebuild too. Vanessa felt a pang in her chest, as though looking into a mirror of her younger self, the version who had knocked on Alexander's mansion door 3 years earlier, desperate for any work at all. She reached out, gently taking Sophia's hands. "Sophia, let me give you one piece of advice," she said softly. "Don't try to go back to who you were. Work to become who you can be. Adversity teaches lessons that comfort never will. Use what you're going through as your advantage." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "But how? How do I even begin again when I've lost everything?" "Begin with dignity," Vanessa said firmly. "Do every honest job with excellence, no matter how small. Observe, learn, build real relationships, and above all, never let your circumstances define who you are inside." She reached into her clutch and handed the girl a sleek business card. "Come see me Monday morning. Perhaps there's a place for you at Belmont and Ross." Sophia's lips trembled into a smile, as if the ground had just shifted under her feet in the best possible way. "Thank you, Miss Ross, truly." "Don't thank me," Vanessa said warmly. "Thank yourself for not giving up." As Sophia disappeared into the crowd, Vanessa stood still for a moment, overwhelmed. She realized that her journey had come full circle. She was no longer just rebuilding her own life, she was now a source of hope for others. And that, more than any award, was the greatest victory. When the gala finally ended, Vanessa and Alexander slipped out of the Copacabana Palace together. The night air was warm, and a soft breeze carried the scent of the ocean. They walked side by side along the sidewalk, the waves crashing rhythmically against the shore. For a while, neither spoke. The weight of the evening, the applause, the recognition, the emotions hung between them like unspoken words. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "Thank you," he said quietly. Vanessa glanced at him. "For what?" "For giving me the chance to become a better man. For not condemning me for my mistakes. For teaching me that it's never too late to change." They continued walking, their footsteps in sync with the waves. Vanessa's gaze drifted to the dark horizon. "Alexander, can I confess something?" "Of course." "For a long time," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability, "I hated you. Not just for how you treated me, but because you represented everything I had lost. You had the money, the respect, the power. All the things I thought I needed back. And now?" he asked softly. "Now I realize you gave me something far more valuable," she said, turning to look at him. "What's that?" "The chance to discover who I really am when all the masks and appearances are stripped away. I learned my strength didn't come from my last name, or from wealth, or from influence. It came from surviving when I had nothing. And that strength is worth more than all the rest." They stopped in front of the hotel, the very place where months earlier Alexander had plotted her humiliation. Vanessa looked up at the Grand Facade, then back at him. "If you could go back in time," Alexander asked carefully, "would you change anything?" Vanessa thought for a long moment before answering. "I would change the way my parents died, the pain they felt losing everything. That's the one thing I wish I could erase. But the rest? No. Because everything that happened brought me here. And here," she said with conviction, "is exactly where I was meant to be." Alexander's chest tightened. For the first time, he understood that her journey had not just been about reclaiming status or power. It had been about transformation, one that had changed them both forever. 6 months later, Vanessa sat in her corner office at Belmont and Ross International Development, sunlight spilling through the tall windows. On her desk lay a letter with careful handwriting on embossed paper. It was from Sophia, the timid young woman she had met after the Copacabana gala. Vanessa read it again, her heart swelling with pride. "Dear Miss Ross, I wanted to thank you once more for giving me a chance. In just half a year, I've grown more than I ever imagined possible. Today, I was officially promoted to project manager for special initiatives, overseeing the opening of our new branch in Portugal. None of this would have been possible without your guidance. You taught me to believe in myself when I had nothing. Forever grateful, Sophia." Vanessa set the letter down, her smile soft. At that moment, Alexander walked in, as he often did without knocking. He leaned over her shoulder, skimming the letter. "She's growing fast," he remarked with a grin. "Careful. 6 more months and she'd be asking to be your partner, too." Vanessa laughed softly. "It would be an honor. The world needs more people willing to rise from the ashes." She slipped the letter into the same drawer where she kept the 2 photographs, the old Society magazine clipping and the Forbes cover. But now there was a third photo beside them, a snapshot from the inauguration of a pediatric hospital in Chile, fully funded by Belmont and Ross. In it, Vanessa was cutting the ribbon, surrounded by smiling children. 3 images, 3 lives. All hers, not just the heiress, not just the fallen maid, but the woman who rebuilt, who lifted others as she rose, who transformed pain into power. Outside the window, the city stretched before her like an ocean of possibilities. And Vanessa Ross, once broken, now unshakable, smiled, knowing that her story was far from over. The greatest chapters were still to be written, because when you learn you can survive the free fall, you also learn you can fly. The end.